Hello, everyone, and welcome to season 2 of What's Eating Us, Maverick Citizens Food Justice Podcast.
Now, it's important to note that South Africa is currently facing immense strain to our public health system. Amongst the strain is the issue of non-communicable diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, which have been linked to ultra-processed foods like bread, cool drinks, breakfast cereals, chips, processed meats, and sweets. Now, listen to these shocking stats. Diabetes is already one of the top 10 causes of death globally, and is even higher in high-income and middle-income countries. The prevalence of diabetes has rapidly increased in South Africa from 4.5% in 2010 to 12.7% in 2019. In South Africa, more than 1 in 3 adults live with high blood pressure, and it's responsible for 1 in every 2 strokes and 2 in every heart attacks. It has also been found that half of adults in South Africa are considered to be overweight or obese, and worryingly, 1 in 6 children are overweight, and 1 in 5 considered obese. So with me today, I have 2 experts in the area of food and public health, and they will be helping us to understand the importance of these warning labels and how the new proposed draft regulations will help stem the rise of non-communicable diseases. So, enough from me. I am going to now hand over to my 2 illustrious experts to talk us through front of package labeling, tell us what their interest in the area of food justice is and the kind of work that they've been involved in. So let's start with you, Petronell.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really fantastic to be here and to talk about such an important policy intervention. And I can already see some movement in the chat box, and I'm hoping we're going to have a lively discussion. So as you can see from my designation in my bubble, I am a public health legal and policy researcher. I have been working in the non-communicable disease and food linkage space for the last 4 years. I am an admitted attorney, and I do have a background in constitutional and administrative law, including working at the Constitutional Court of South Africa and some previous experience working on a United Nations Special Rapporteur group. So really looking forward to bringing a little bit of a legal and constitutional perspective here today and talking about how ultimately we can ensure that we protect the constitutional right to health of all South Africans. Thank you.
Thanks, Petronell. That was a great introduction. Nzama?
Thank you so much. And I think I could pick up on the chat box. Lovely to have widespread geographical, even nationally people. I'm Nzama Mbalati. I'm the programs manager for HEALA. I've been doing this for more than 5 years now, being with Healthy Living Alliance. And really, it's very interesting that we're getting into the trajectory of the front of pack warning label. And I think it's important that we can raise the issue. This is about the right to know. And I think the food industry for so many years has been hiding to consumers what we are eating. So we are eating food that we cannot comprehend what are the ingredients. And I think this reminds me of the work that HEALA has done in the past few weeks in KZN. So we were invited in an old age home. And the people who were there, some of them are already living with the health conditions such as diabetes and high blood pressure. And they were like, it's so difficult for us to comprehend what we are eating. And we need to follow certain script in terms of diet. And we're talking about the broader population and understanding now the relationship between food and health, that, unhealthy food, junk food, ultra-processed food do have increases our risk of developing ill health. So the front of pack is actually a basic tool in our toolbox that can actually enable consumers to understand what we are eating. Because I think the food literacy level or nutrition literacy level, if you have not studied nutrition, for example, you will not be able to comprehend and read what is written at the back of the pack. Never mind the time it will take you to read the long list, the long range list of very technical nutrition language that is written. And over and above, there is a lot of nutrition claims that are actually put in the current packaging of food. So you will buy a yogurt that will say it's low in fat, right? But it doesn't tell you that that yogurt has a high sugar content, you know. So it's important, front of pack galvanize the right to know for consumers. And I think it actually increases the literacy level in terms of understanding the basic nutrition and what we are actually eating and consuming as the population. Thank you.
Thanks, Nzama. Yeah, I just want to actually, that leads me into my first question of understanding what you are consuming, right? So let's go back to this point of ultra-processed foods, right? What do ultra-processed foods look like? Just for a person on a day-to-day basis, what is an ultra-processed food? And who are the people who are most likely to eat most of these ultra-processed food? Is there like a demographic disposition that is likely, to be eating more ultra-processed foods than other people? So can you get into a little bit of that for me?
Thanks so much. You can go first, Petronell. Go after you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Zukiswa. I see we've already have some interest in defining ultra-processed foods in the chat box. So I think a really good way for us to understand ultra-processed food is set out in Chris van Tulleken from the UK's new book, Ultra-Processed People. And he really summarizes what a whole host of researchers have been saying. Most significantly, Carlos Montero from Latin America, who's done a lot of work on what we call de novo classification. And effectively, ultra-processed food is the step beyond sort of standard processing. We understand people process food. When you bake a cake, that's a form of processing. And that's when you start introducing industrial processes and industrial additives. So Marion Nestle says a great way to look at it is an ultra-processed food is something that as an ordinary person, you won't be able to make in your own kitchen because you won't have access to, for example, the relevant way of packaging the food or the relevant ingredients that would be added. And why are foods ultra-processed? I mean, for a variety of reasons, to increase shelf life, to make sure then that those foods can be transported. So it becomes really relevant when we see foods being transported from global north countries and to make the food more appealing. So you have colorants being added, so cosmetic additives, and you also have all kinds of flavorants. And the idea is to effectively make the food tastier at the end of the day, and to reach what some would call a bliss point. I mean, ultimately, it is for a company that produces ultra-processed food, they want to make sure that the people who eat the food enjoy the food. And then they add additional things. Now, the problem is that does actually have an impact on the way your brain functions. I was just reading the Yale Food Addictive Scale and a recent study that they've done. And they've now estimated that if you look at the properties of addiction, the way you would look at tobacco and liquor, that up to 14% of adults and 12% of children would be able to qualify for a clinical diagnosis of addiction. And that becomes a problem. And I think that's what's at the crux. So, and just for comparison, that's sort of the same rate that you have for liquor and tobacco. And I think that's the discussion we're having here. We're seeing one way that I've heard ultra-processed foods being framed is that it's not actually a food. It's sort of an industrial processed edible guck. And that is a little, I will say that, there are measures, and that describes most ultra processed foods and not all, but we're starting to reach a point where we're seeing that people eat foods that they should not be eating, and that doesn't have nutritional value, and that contains things that's bad for their brain, and that have all hosts of additional elements being connected to it, including some really important preliminary studies showing that there's a link with cancer.
Thanks for that, Petronell. It's a little frightening there, especially the point about addiction, particularly amongst children. So Nzama, just to go back to my question, what is kind of like the demographic leanings of people who are more likely to have higher consumption of ultra-processed foods?
Yeah, and I think that is the most critical question, Zuki, because people eat food and buy food that they can afford, that is available, that is accessible. So if you look at the end of the day, what determines the food that people eat? Like, in a sense, we're eating the food that is filling with poor nutrition, right? And the most hard hit people is the poor and the working class people, right? And actually, it's not a secret that a huge investment by the food and beverage industries is going to the low income households. So the issue of food is the issue of equity. So in a country with high unemployment, with a triple epidemic of the unemployment, poverty, and the hunger that we see, people are actually having to opt to get food that they can afford, right? So it's an issue of buying power. So when households don't have an income, they opt for the food that is filling, that is cheaper, and the advantage that the unhealthy food industry has taken is to look at the low income household, and say these people need food. We can make food that is filling, very poor in nutrition, and I think if you look also for children, right, the infant formula, right, the lives that we are living, even for the high income household. So it means all of us, we are actually economically active, right? If we have a family, if you have a child, whether a single or a parent, you will need to actually feed your child. So if you're going to work, you need to feed your child. So what the industry has done is to look at the gaps of poverty, hunger, and unemployment, and actually tap into that and say, we can make an ultra processed food that is $30 that can fill you. And then if you are low income household or you are working class citizen, you will be able to purchase that food. They've made it very much convenient, palatable, right? And actually like instant cooks, even in some of the ultra processed food. And I think it's important that when we look at that, we're looking at the country with so much high inequality and poverty, that it's not by coincidence that the low-income household, the poor people, are the most targeted in terms of that. Yesterday, I'm in Limpopo right now. Yesterday, there was a huge truck with cold drinks that were given to people for free. But people had to write their names and phone numbers. Why is that? That cold drink is for free, but at the expense of having your details for further marketing. So a huge investment is put on marketing and portraying the ultra processed food and unhealthy beverages to be punting them and making them in your face. So everywhere you go, and which is one of the biggest issue globally and in South Africa, is that because the food environment is skewed towards poor people not being able to afford, it's also vigorously marketed. It's also easily accessible, right? So you talk about any spaza shop next to where I am, you will be able to easily get ultra processed food. So we're having a very unregulated food environment, which makes it which makes people more vulnerable and more susceptible to actually purchase the food because it's cheaper. If you look at the market, for example, of the energy drinks, right? You can get an energy drink as less as 6 rand, 8 rands. So in a place where you need something that is cold, in a place where I am where it's warm, you need something that is from a fridge. It doesn't matter whether it's healthy or not. So there has been the industry has been able to study the market and target really. It's not different actually if you look at tobacco, right? The target is for people who have never smoked than people who are already smoking. And now the biggest problem is we're having the huge epidemic that you outlined at the beginning. So we used to think, and actually I'm talking of myself, we used to think like diabetes and high blood pressure, it's actually the conditions of rich people. It's so funny. But the tide has actually turned so much with the proliferation of ultra-processed food that has penetrated the market. So if you look at the fast food retail store, they're actually in villages now, not townships. So in a village where I am, there is actually a fast food retail shop for a treat for people. In a place where I am, because of the vigorous marketing as well, we have fruits and vegetables quite affordable and available in people's yards. But people take the food for economic reasons, right? And then they go and buy the fast food because why? It's a lifestyle. If you are seen to be eating in a retail fast food, it's part of self-esteem, self-fulfillment. It's part of achievement that you can be able to do a drive-through and being able to actually buy ultra-processed food. So this is very targeted at the low-income household for the poor and the working-class people.
Yeah, that's quite a insidious sort of picture that you're painting there, Nzama. But I want to pick up on this issue just to bring us back to the draft regulations of what it is that they actually say. You know, what do the regulations actually say? What do people need to know, and why should people care? You know, maybe let's start with you, Petronell.
Sure, absolutely. I think let's maybe start with the why should people care, and then we can go to the free effective things that the regulations assists with. So what do we know? All right, we know, and we actually saw on Tuesday, Statistics South Africa has come out with some fairly scary health statistics. So we know that in South Africa, 1 in 2 deaths will be caused by non-communicable diseases. We know that the rate of non-communicable disease has gone up 58% in the last 20 years based on this newest findings. We know that as a South African, you have a 1 in 6 chance of dying from a cardiovascular disease. Okay, so this is a really big problem. We know that the World Health Organization has said that low and middle income countries have about a 65% death rate due to non-communicable diseases. So whatever your personal position on this is, we know that we have a crisis and that people are dying because of non-communicable diseases. We also know, based on a variety of studies in South Africa and internationally, from a variety of institutions, that people struggle to understand what's in their food. So it could be a host of things. People sometimes struggle to read the font size, to locate the nutritional information. People sometimes have an apathy. They don't understand how to interpret the specific food designation. I am a public health lawyer, so I am not a food scientist. So I sometimes struggle with the different ways in which foods are labeled. So why is this important? Firstly, I want to just emphasize this regulation is about information. It is not about prohibition unless it's about prohibiting certain discrete marketing practices which should not exist and which is evidence-based. This regulation predominantly wants to inform people of what is in their food. Okay. That is something that you have a constitutional right to. So the Constitution is very clear. Everyone has a right to access to information. This right even extends to information from private parties when you need it to protect any of your other human rights. That would include things like your right to health and to access to food and basic nutrition for children. So that is very important. So the regulation says that it's developed a South African prepared nutrient profile model using cutoff points to tell people what is in their food and whether or not, using an objective standard, they should be made aware of something specifically. So does the food have too much sugar in it? Does it have too much fat in it? So the idea is to then give information to consumers and to assist where there are literacy. My apologies. It's not because we think South Africans have lower levels of literacy than all over the world. Understanding food labels have always been a problem, and there's always been a move to increasing this sort of literacy gap. We have seen front of pack warning labels being tested in South Africa. The specific label that is being suggested by the department is locally based, and we have seen studies where it's been shown that consumers have an appetite for this. The second component of this is that if a food is deemed to have too much of a specific nutrient that is problematic, then certain what we would call child-directed marketing techniques are not to be employed. Now, if you think about it, out of a morality perspective, the fact that we are marketing to children is obscene. The fact that we're specifically addressing commercial messaging to a group of people in the country where we have acknowledged in all other aspects of our law that there is a certain vulnerability and that they're in the process of developing their brain is insane. We have restrictions on when children can conclude contracts. We have restrictions on when people can vote. So the fact that we want to make it a free-for-all when it comes to persuasive commercial messaging is problematic. And if you have an issue with restricting marketing of any goods to children, I cannot understand what your motive will be unless it is a profit motive. So that's what the regulations does. It creates or gives us a nutrient profile model that was developed in South Africa. It creates a labeling system that is intended to inform South Africans as they have a constitutional right. And it's intended to protect specifically children from marketing of foods that are deemed harmful. So those are the three pillars of the legislation.
Tune in next time for part 2 of this installment of What's Eating Us with Maverick Citizen.